story begins inside of Palpatine's office. The Chancellor and his future people were walking around the chambers. Palpatine was speaking to his young friend the way he always did. His voice was almost hard to hear, but Anakin listened closely as Palpatine told him that he was appointing him to be his personal representative on the High Council. Naturally, Anakin assumed this meant he'd receive the rank of Master, but he and Palpatine continued their talk until Skywalker made his way back to the temple. Before Anakin got back to his Jedi starship, he turned back and looked down the corridor he came from. Palpatine had vanished back into his office, and all the excitement Anakin had for his potential new promotion fell off from under him. He had spoken to Yoda about his visions earlier. He didn't get the answers he wanted. He had the opportunity to become a master on the council, and he could find his own answers through that. But realistically, Anakin thought to himself, the council would never approve of this. They operated in cooperation with the Senate, but they would never allow the Chancellor to make such a move. Anakin had to think about this. If he truly wanted to earn the rank of Master, he couldn't do it by playing Palpatine's game. He opened the cockpit of the starship and settled into it. The latch closed and his eyes focused on the control panel. He flipped some switches and pulled the yoke back before he launched it forward once the ship was in the air. His thoughts continued down the path as he passed skyscrapers across the city skyline. Anakin's eyes drifted from traffic patterns, buildings, the plaza, and eventually to the Jedi Temple. He realized that maybe Palpatine was right to applaud him and appoint him to the High Council, but perhaps it would be better if he did something more erratic. Anakin came up with his own counter-strategy for this, and when he eventually got to the council chambers, he had his answer. Skywalker stood before the brightest minds of the Jedi Order. They were all in agreement that Palpatine had overstepped the boundaries of the Jedi and Senate. Maybe they had in the past, but they did not like the Chancellor interfering with Jedi affairs. The council would come to a conclusion about their plans moving forward before the Battle of Coruscant ever happened. Skywalker looked across the chambers as the council members spoke quietly amongst themselves. Yoda expressed how troubling this decision was by the Chancellor. Mace Windu continued and said that the council had agreed to allow him into their chambers, that he was not to be granted the rank of Master. Skywalker wanted to react. He truthfully did, but achieving the rank of Master was more than just being a council member. It was either done with an extraordinary feat, one not necessarily based in killing another individual, or it was done through training a student to knighthood. Anakin admitted to himself subconsciously that defeating Dooku was an extraordinary feat for any Jedi, but he still executed him. While the council didn't know that, he wasn't deserving of the rank even in his own opinion for executing Dooku. Regardless, he believed that this was going to happen. He was right, and now he needed to react with maturity. Anakin looked around to the counselors and accepted their kindness, expressing that it had always been his dream to sit with them in this chamber and discuss the future of the Jedi Order together, but he didn't believe it was right for this ascension to take place now. He explained that he would rather earn the seat through their decision, and through his own extraordinary feat or training of another to become the Master to accompany such an ascension. The council was silent. Anakin stood there, keeping a grin on his face. He completely flabbergasted them. He personally didn't agree with this decision. He knew it was against his own feelings, but he needed to try it. So in a way to counter his humility, he suggested that a way to potentially earn their seat and the rank of Master, he would let the Tikis flee to Raxus and capture the home world of the Separatist movement. He could effectively end the war with a battle there. The counselors looked to each other. This wasn't actually a terrible idea. None of them saw this coming, and they expected Anakin to take the seat, because according to Obi-Wan, it was Anakin's dream to have it. Obviously, his denial of the rank would mean that they couldn't spy on the Chancellor, but that's alright. Maybe they didn't need to spy on him. Perhaps there were other ways to figure this out. Consistently wrong one-liner master, Ki-Adi-Mundi, told Anakin that half of his forces would deploy at Mandalorian. He wouldn't have the fighting power to take control of Raxus. Anakin finally let his smile shine, as he told Master Mundi that he had won battles at greater odds. This would be no different for him and his men. The council expressed that they would consider it, thanking him for both his humility and his honesty. When Anakin left the room, they erupted into confusion and even a little bit of chaos. They would have to approve this mission, right? Skywalker had to ponder everything. Maybe it was the wrong decision. He was petrified of losing Padme. The thought of losing her was nightmarish to him, but this had to be tried. If he could capture Raxus in the next 24 to 48 hours, he could come back here in time to be a mastered and safer. A lot of this was going to be a close call, but he had to try it. Playing the long game with the council never works for him, and it probably wouldn't work here either. He just gave them the chance to see his value, while also showing them that he was willing to be cooperative with them. It was a good way to ensure he and the council remained on peaceful terms. While he waited, he was given an invitation to join the Chancellor at the Opera House for a show that evening. Anakin accepted because what harm could come from it? Without the council getting back to him, he was a little worried, but he was hopeful that this would speed things up for him. At least in his mind, going to the opera would take his mind off of everything else. When Anakin got there, the vibes were off. First, Palpatine told him about General Grievous, and then prodded about how the council reacted to everything. Anakin didn't find this part to be odd, mostly because he and Palpatine had spoken about the High Council numerous times, and those conversations were always about how negligent the Jedi had been to his emotions. Palpatine was seemingly looking for a chance to make Anakin upset at the Jedi, and despite his emotions being out of whack, it was a little awkward. Anakin didn't have anything against them at the moment, so he wasn't trying to speak to anyone about the Jedi. He was just trying to get through today so he could get on to the next task. Palpatine did sneak the tragedy of Darth Plagueis' demise into their conversation, but again, he didn't think much of it. He felt the concept was interesting, but he was pretty locked into his idea. Maybe he would have a chance to change his mind if the council didn't take him up on his offer. However, with the news he was able to deliver to the council the following day regarding the whereabouts of General Grievous, they decided to send Master Saci to Araxis with Anakin. He didn't have a large division to work with, but any little aid would still help, and that couldn't be neglected. The council was doing this for a couple reasons. They gave this mission over to Anakin because they would have someone with him, but his point was still valid. Capturing Raxus would be the best way to end the Clone War, but it could possibly elicit the council a chance to take more control over the situation on Coruscant with Palpatine. Initially, they agreed to have Anakin spy on the Chancellor. Now in hindsight, maybe that wasn't the best idea for them. In this scenario, they would have Obi-Wan fighting Grievous, as Anakin and Saci led an important assault on Raxus. Both of these Jedi groups could achieve victory, and with said victory, they could take control over the Senate if Palpatine refused to give up his emergency powers. Kenobi would escort Anakin and Saci to their vessels. Due to the unit being smaller than the 7th Sky Corps, and 212th, they were able to mobilize much quicker. Kenobi would be leaving shortly after. Anakin did speak to Padme, but she didn't have any issues with anything. Obviously to her, this was just the normal sequence of events. The war was going on, Anakin had to return to the Outer Rim sieges. His nightmare from the other night didn't really concern her, despite Anakin promising that he would save her from his dreams. She believed that everything would be alright anyways, and that the war would be over soon, and that they would be able to have their happily ever after afterwards. Anakin and Saci departed to Raxus and spoke on strategy. Anakin had the larger clone legion out of the two of them, plus the fighter first was much more battle-tested. However, due to Jedi ranking, Saci would have more control, but he, in accordance to the Council, was splitting command with Skywalker. This, in the eyes of the High Council, was Anakin's last task. Without spying on the Chancellor, they needed another way to test him, to make sure he was worthy of the rank of Master and a role inside their chambers. The Council didn't want Anakin to be one of them, but it was just a matter of making sure they could fully trust him. Without having time to inform Palpatine about his deployment, the Jez was completely unaware. He would find out later when he was reading up on the report activities of active fleets leaving. But at the moment, he wasn't watching out of his window to see which fleet was leaving the planet. Palpatine's reasoning for checking fleet deployments was to see if the Council actually sent Anakin to fight Grievous. The idea of Skywalker going to Raxus never crossed his mind, because he purposely set this up to get Anakin to distrust the Council. He never anticipated for Anakin to deny his spot or leave for a completely separate mission. For now, he was plotting other potential outcomes of the scenario, situations in which Anakin both left and stayed on Coruscant, obviously without the information or knowledge at the moment of what action Skywalker had taken. In hyperspace, Master and Knight stood on the bridge. Commander Appa was standing next to Skywalker as they went over their approach. Admiral Yularen was quietly examining the entire battle map. Anakin suggested a little bit of a crazy idea. They hadn't done something like this since the Citadel rescue, and it would be much larger in scale. But Anakin suggested riding their fleet hard to the right flank and deploying all their landing craft and sending it across the starboard side of their fleet. But it would allow the ground forces to make the landing approach without any worry of getting blown out of the sky. Their ace pilots be able to maintain dogfights with the Separatists, and a wing of fighters led by Master 10 or Skywalker, if he was willing to agree with this plan, could cover the ground assault. Saci raised an eyebrow. With the Jedi Master, one couldn't tell if he was judging or admiring. He had a certain wit about him that was serious in tone, but interested in mind. Master 10 smiled and looked to Skywalker and expressed that he was the general. His eyes moved over to Admiral Yularen and asked him for his thoughts. The Admiral just nodded his head. He had lost plenty of these little battles with Anakin. He wasn't going to try and even argue here. Plus, it actually may have been one of Anakin's best decisions tactically. In the meantime, Anakin went down to the hangar bay where his men were gathering up, preparing for their approach. Skywalker was tightening up his starfighter, considering he would be providing cover fire with it, before jumping out and allowing R2 to pilot the ship back up to the fleet. Stacy walked over to the ship and knelt down, where Anakin was, obviously still under the ship, but he could sense the Jedi Master. He asked Stacy what was going on, and he said nothing, but he returned another question. He asked why Anakin rejected his appointment to the High Council. Anakin's metallic arm reached out and he pressed himself forward, escaping from the underbelly of the starfighter. As he came out, he pressed a panel in until it clicked, before leaning up and looking over to Stacy. He told the Jedi Master that he was tired. He chilled off for a moment before continuing, tired of constantly bickering with the Council. He understood that there was something, whether it be dislike, distrust, or simply a hierarchical or systematic thing. But he knew that there was tension there, and he didn't want it anymore, so he was cutting the head off the snake. Why continue to have tension if it wasn't necessary? Putting himself on the Council at the Chancellor's request would ruin that dynamic. He knew they elected their own members, and they elected masters, not knights. Stacy could see the pain in Anakin's face as he said this. He didn't want to play the game. This wasn't something that was fun for Skywalker, but he was doing it so he could potentially save Padme. It may have seemed like the long way around doing it, but in his mind, it may have been the best way to accomplish it. He told Stacy that he understood he wasn't welcome, and he didn't want to impede on that. Master Tin wasn't the most compassionate person. He sat in the middle between Ki-Adi-Mundi and Plo Koon. But he told Anakin that no one disliked him. Everyone on the Council wanted the best for him, but they also believed that he needed to be pushed. He continued said that Master Kenobi was hopeful that he would feel at ease with the promotion, but the Council was truthfully caught off guard by the entire decision made by Anakin. They didn't expect it, but here they were, now. Stacy told Anakin that while he understood it wasn't the easiest decision, what Skywalker did was show the Council more than ever that he could be trusted. In Stacy's mind, this wasn't blowing his cover, but he was being blunt and honest, something the Jedi Master was known for doing. Master Tin then apologized because he knew that not being Master was a burden for Anakin. Not because ascending was his main goal, but because Anakin deserved the rank. Everyone knew it. But in accordance to the code, they could not and would not give it over without the previously mentioned scenarios. All Stacy could say to Anakin was that as long as he continued to trust the Force, his patience would be rewarded. Anakin nodded his head with a smile as Stacy moved to his personal starfighter. Master Kenobi arrived at Utapau before the Battle of Raxus ever began. After Palpatine back on Coruscant, he was just now learning of the recent departures. Palpatine was a little unnerved by this decision, because with Anakin off-planet and likely hours away from securing victory over the Separatists, he needed to contain his own power. Even without Anakin telling him that the Jedi were watching his every move, he knew that the Council was likely to make a move. With Yoda off-world, leaving Mace, Fisto, Agan, Pullman, and Shakti on Coruscant, he had 5 true opponents to worry about. The question for Palpatine was when Windu would make his move. There wasn't a doubt in his mind that he would. Palpatine knew that with all the Jedi spread out, he'd be able to execute Order 66. The biggest issue was when the Republic fleet dropped out of hyperspace over Raxus, and the battle began immediately. Long-range cannons on both sides opened fire. Luckily, the Separatists were hurting after the battle off Coruscant, so with victory in their eyes, Republic morale was up. The only issue is, aside from less vessels, the Separatists didn't have to worry about making sure their troop morale was high. Anakin and Stacy nodded to each other, as Skywalker took point and fled the flagship. Fighter squadrons poured out behind them, and finally, at what felt like the final battle of the Clone Wars, the Republic launched in action. The fleet battle was massive. Managers paved the way with light cruisers and corvettes pumping their engines forward and providing cover fire for the landing vessels. As predicted, the Separatist fighter forces moved in. Republic V-Wings and ARC-170s jumped into action, led by Stacy Tin. With the dogfight commencing, taking up a majority of the mid-ground between both fleets, Skywalker sped forward aboarding flak as ARC-170s ride behind him. Their S-foils locked into attack position, and they fired at any droids that could break through the dogfight. Anakin's pallets radiated into him, telling him it was clear and calling up command signals. Someone had a bogey and they were covered by an LAAT gunner. Another signal called out thanks. Anakin would just control yaw from side to side before rolling into a spin and slamming the trigger in, blasting through 2 or 3 volt droids. They rounded about the wee Venator, and as they did, they matched speed with the 4 Arquentans that were essentially working as shields. On Anakin's starboard, the corvettes were speeding up. The lead corvette called to the Jedi General and told him they were going to push for the surface. He acknowledged. Anakin called back to the ace pilot and his ARC squad and told them to prepare for their bonding run on the turbo towers on the surface. He also acknowledged, thanks to the ARC twins, the LAATs and dropships were able to avoid heavy flak. There were a couple of vessels shot out of the sky, but overall, it was relatively successful. Anakin launched his fighter forward as the landing group moved through the atmosphere of Raxus. Once it broke the cover, they were greeted with thousands of blaster bolts filling the skyline. Anakin ducked inside of his cockpit before spinning his ship to the side, and leading the arcs down towards the turbo lasers and what was behind them, which was the shield generator. Above him, the Corvettes powered their engines forward and gave extra targets before deploying their escape pods and watching them collide with the ground, igniting explosions. That was Anakin's idea. Fill up the escape pods with bombs and then drop them in the towers to protect their troops. It worked too. The first line of turbo towers detonated, with the wall protecting the capital crumbling. Out in space, Master Tin could see the fight of powder was clearing up, and Admiral Yulorn informed them that the landing party was clear. They could proceed with their next leg of their assault, Sace acknowledged, before leading a wing of B-wings down the side of the Separatist flank. With the move made by the Republic so focused on the Separatist port side, they were trying to react, but the Beneders continued pulling hard to surround the Separatist fleet. Sace's fighters were able to hit unshielded weapons, as the Beneders under Yulorn's command crushed through the frigates guarding the far side of the flank. With less numbers than the Separatists, it was incredibly important for the Republic to take out as many support vessels as possible. On the ground, Anakin leapt from his starfighter and landed right next to Commander Oppo. He raised his lightsaber and yelled out the orders to charge. The clones beside him moved in towards the city. Oppo had just received information before they landed that General Kenobi had engaged with General Grievous. The clones knew, and Anakin was informed before they breached the city gates. The war was closer than ever to being over. Inside the communication room at the Jedi Temple, Master Windu stood quietly. He was observing everything. Cody had just informed them of the battle beginning. Windu was able to tell Yulorn and Oppo, who informed the Jedi about the success at the landing of Raxus. Windu turned to Master Coleman Cash, Agan Polar, and Kit Fisto. He nodded his head, and the four then moved from the room. Once they exited, Mace looked around and then spoke to them quietly. As Yoda said, the Organa thought would take them down a dark path, but it was time they made a move on the Chancellor. They were going to win this war. They could not allow Palpatine to make some sort of foothold inside the Senate. Despite their beliefs that Palpatine could be a Sith Lord, they didn't think he had the power to do anything super crazy. Mace decided that before they went, they needed to speak to Master Shakti. She was beginning to have these really intense visions, and Mace believed she might be learning of a future that was yet to happen. Across the city, following Master Kash's interruption of Shakti's meditation, Palpatine was making his move. After all this time, after all their planning, he would do it now. He had come up with a plan. He would blame Order 66 on the Jedi and essentially say it backfired on them. With Nala Se in his pocket, he'd make her call out the Jedi for being behind it, and then he would exploit her skills for his own use. Palpatine set the Royal Guard up at the entrance of his office and walked over to the communication table, and began issuing out orders. Across every major battlefight in the galaxy, the Jedi would die. On Utapau, Obi-Wan and Grievous would both become targets, as they'd have to work together without killing each other to survive. For Obi-Wan would eventually decapitate Grievous and use him as a body shield. Gerinundi actually survived. As for the rest of the battles, they continued to escalate, and the Jedi were turned on. As for Coruscant, due to the major units being deployed, Palpatine had to rely on the Coruscant Guard. However, he was in for his own surprise. Halfway through the activation of his contingency orders, Council members Mace Windu, Coleman Cash, Kit Fisto, and Agan Polar ignited their weapons and told Palpatine to stand down after wiping out the Royal Guards at the entrance. Sidious was caught off guard. He stumbled back and issued out one more order to the last commander on the hologram. Nace could hear his name. It was Depa's clone commander. Nace told the Jedi to spread out, and they did. Because Palpatine didn't have time to place a riddle inside their minds, they were completely prepared. Sidious moved across the room, slowly. He didn't have the advantage he would have had otherwise. Instead of one lid, it was two, and who was going to win regardless? On Raxus, Skywalker and his troops ran into the city. Street fighting was their game. The clones followed behind their Jedi General, as he took point. He used the Force as he ran to the corner to hold a tank in place as a rocket trooper ran around and got on his knee, before firing a shot into the tank and detoned it. Anakin ran forward, Apple behind him, firing into the Separatist lines. They broke into the Separatist governmental building. Anakin raised his blade as the super tactical droid standing there threw his hands up and surrendered. The leader of the Separatist movement, in lieu of Dooku's death, walked forward and told the Jedi General that they were surrendering. As Anakin took a step back, he felt a shock of pain rise in his chest. His eyes got blurry and he stumbled into the wall. He told Otto to take care of the diplomacy. He would be back. Something was wrong. Appa told the medic to go with Anakin, and he did. As Skywalker stepped outside, he looked into the sky where the clouds covered the sun. He fell to his knees and placed his hand over his chest. The medic got to his side and asked if he was alright. Anakin nodded his head, telling him that he was feeling something in his chest. Something was wrong. He turned over to the medic and patted him on the shoulder, thanking him for checking on him, but the troopers nearly cared more than he did. The medic nodded and disappeared around the corner. Anakin grabbed his comm link and contacted Stacey, asking him if he had felt it. Master Tim was struggling with the change in the Force too, but since they were winning in the space battle, he was going to meet Anakin on the surface. Inside the executive building, Palpatine's blade shrieked with an ear-piercing cry. Two Jedi Masters were holding him at arm's length apart, with Coleman charging in. Palpatine kicked his feet forward, smacking Coleman's wrist and snapping him backwards. Sidious used the leverage to jump backwards and electrocute the floor in front of him. Mace jumped off the ground and swung down. Fisto, Polar, and Kaj fell to the knees as their bodies were filled with electricity. Windu and Palpatine engaged, their blades slugging away. Palpatine ducked and swung backwards from Mace's blood. He used the Force to grab furniture. Mace stepped back and avoided a counter from another stride, before launching the furniture across the rug. It clipped Palpatine's ankle, but it didn't stop him. He warded off, jabbing his left blade forward and swinging his right blade upwards from the ground. In Shatterpoint, Mace was able to see everything moments before it happened. His lightsaber swung in front of him. As he slid to the side, not looting his legs but only his torso, he forced his blade forward, pushing the jab away before flipping his weapon back into a reverse grip and blocking the other strike. Explore hit him from behind. Sidious scalped before Fisto lunged forward, clipping Palpatine's forearm. Agan and Coleman were right behind him, leaping over and around Mace. He stuttered step, catching Coleman off guard and kicking his thigh up at its socket. Agan and Fisto were quick, chatting forward. One of the premier duelists in the Order and one of the few Jedi to best General Grievous together. Mace put his lightsaber in one hand and stepped in. Fisto and Cole engaged against a very aggravated Sidious. He defended himself expertly, using his furniture to get away from his opponents who were making his duel incredibly difficult. Palpatine slid under a strike from Fisto and blocked another one from Kohler, before turning around and losing his forearm. He used this to fuel him, as Cullen ripped around swinging his lightsaber forward, cutting Palpatine's other hand off. Mace dragged his lightsaber around and then stopped at Palpatine's neck, telling him to surrender. As they were preparing to imprison the Sith Lord, so that he could be tried in front of the Galactic Senate, Master Shag-Ti contacted them. Her meditation was disrupted by Master Taj before they came here to confront Palpatine, and she couldn't get back into it, so now she was fighting something. There was a siege at the Jedi Temple. Panic filled their bodies, but Mace reacted, grabbing Palpatine's shoulder and shoving him towards the Ginsk, raising his blade so close to his throat that his skin cells were burning up under the immense heat. He demanded answers, but Palpatine had nothing to say. He just smiled and waited for the Master of the Order to lose his cool. But he didn't. He couldn't. Not now. Across the galaxy, Jedi were getting dropped by the dozen. Inside the temple, the case was far from the same. But the real issue started to develop on mixed battlefronts. For example, on Kashyyyk, there were multiple Jedi Masters present. One of the clone commanders would get Order 66 and relay it to his own men, but the other unit of clones would never get the order. So one Jedi Master would be killed and the other would survive, and when the clones tried to kill that individual Master, the Jedi's clones would protect them. It didn't just happen on Kashyyyk, but on numerous battlefronts. On Raxus, Anakin and Stacey weren't feeling the physical repercussions of Order 66 because neither of them men turned on them. Instead, their men informed them that there was a set of orders going around in the clone ranks. But these orders, despite being numerous and across the galaxy, weren't shared with everyone, so they didn't know if it was intentionally done or not. Due to the data being encrypted and a clone technician like Clone Force 99 member Tech not being present, the clones couldn't retrieve the order. Stacey grabbed Anakin's shoulder and told him to return to Coruscant and see what was happening. He would handle everything here on Raxus. Anakin nodded his head and ran to an opening so R2 could pick him up, before they entered a hyperspace ring and jumped for Coruscant. Inside the capital of the Republic, chaos was commencing, but it could have been much worse. Nace and his squad captured Palpatine, making sure that he was still alive so he could live out the rest of his life in prison. The temple, after about a half-hour siege, was able to hold the line. The Coruscant Guard got the jump on the Jedi, and with the betrayal of Grand Inquisitor, there was a chance for the Guard to break through their lines. But they eventually faltered, and Sindralik, Shag-Ti, and the Temple Guard unit were able to break through the Coruscant men and push them away from their home. Instead of retreating due to restricted airspace, the Jedi under Sindralik's orders locked down the temple. The only two allowed to enter were Mace's squad and Skywalker, who arrived shortly after they did. When Anakin got there, the Jedi were conducting some sort of ritual. It looked like an exorcism, and maybe it was, but Palpatine was laid out on a table and the Jedi were stripping him of his ability to use the Force. Jocasta held a data pad that had the proper instructions on it. They were taking his abilities from him. The great thing about this ritual is it would remove all of his learned abilities. He would still have his midichlorians, which the Jedi would use to their advantage until the trial was over. When the trial was finished, they would completely strip Palpatine of the Force. As Anakin entered, Mace took him to the side and thanked him for his work. Skywalker didn't understand, and maybe he didn't need to. All that mattered in Mace's mind was their temporary victory, one gifted to them due to Anakin's decision to avoid being on the council. If he could choose any time to be humble, he picked the perfect time to do it. Mace handed Anakin off to Sid Dralik, who would conduct his master's ceremony for him. Windu did apologize because everything was super informal, but he wanted to get this out of the way, especially after Stacey's report. Mace promised him that there would be a proper ceremony after everything was finished, but he earned this. The Jedi would have their response. With Civil War-like battles taking place on battlefronts galaxy-wide, the Jedi and clones were looking for a chance to resolve whatever it was that Order 66 was. The Jedi were clueless, and the clones weren't able to be spoken with. While Anakin was searching through the archives, the Jedi escorted Palpatine back to the Senate in an emergency session. They were able to gather evidence to support their case, and the Senate didn't care for it. The Jedi were kind of in a bind with this entire thing, because the Senate refused to believe that their precious old Chancellor could do something so heinous. Luckily for them, one of the Joint Mission Jedi was able to get a hologram recording of Palpatine's execution of Order 66, showing a hologram of both Palpatine's body, voice, and mannerisms, telling clones to execute an executive order that no one knew about. The singular reason this hologram existed was the clone captain that received the order always recorded holograms. He was an OCD-riddled trooper that was very particular about his organization skills. He and another clone got into a fight because he was trying to kill the Jedi, and the other wasn't. The captain tried to show the hologram to the clone who was fighting him back, but he ended up falling off a cliff during the scuffle. The Jedi tried to save the clone but couldn't. Instead, they saved their own commander from hearing the order that zombified the clone captain. The Jedi sent that order to the temple, and now it was being played before the Senate. With concrete evidence, plus the fact that an M-count check was done on Palpatine, they were ready to convict him, but it wouldn't be that simple. An entire long-haul process would take place, one lasting for several months. The irony about everything was the Jedi keeping Palpatine's M-count as if it would mean something to the Senate or public, because it didn't mean anything to them. But thanks to the Jedi effort to win the war, thanks to Anakin's attack at Praxis, the Jedi didn't have a whole lot to worry about when it came to public trust in the final moments of the war. Order 66 was the biggest saving grace for the Jedi. Many senators publicly admitted that had there not been any attempt to exterminate the Jedi, these conversations likely wouldn't be happening. But thanks to the desire to make change in the galaxy, these conversations were allowing the democratic process to take point. In the months it would take to get to Palpatine's sentencing, a lot would transpire. Anakin and Palpatine would start family life, while living their double lives. The Separatist Council would get caught trying to send a broadcast to Sidious's frequency, which happened to be in Palpatine's office. This was actually a huge coincidence. Palpatine had it with him so they could direct them after the war was over, due to Order 66, but that never came because he got jumped by the Jedi. It was a nail in the coffin after Palpatine's defense and the Separatist leaders who didn't surrender at Raxus. The post-era was one of conflict, but no large-scale battles. The droid army was decommissioned entirely, and the clones were forced to continue working, if they wanted. Tamina was shut down and turned into a refuge camp for clones looking for home life. The integration for clones into civilization be a whole other topic of discussion for the Senate. Anakin never really got his head around the Order 66 conflict, mostly because it never directly affected him in the field. He was offered a seat on the council, which he took, but he never involved himself in the trial of Palpatine. Anakin found it best for himself to just pretend Palpatine died during the war. He instead led a sect of the Jedi Order in assisting the refugees of the war, and helping them with the entire rebuilding side of things. It brought him peace of mind. Plus, it allowed for him to be both around his clones and spend time with his wife and children when he came back, which was more often than it was during the war. A key reason for his stay inside the Order was Ahsoka rejoining. The incident on Mandalore after Order 66's execution was chaotic, but it resulted in Walt dying and Ahsoka surviving. Despite Anakin's lack of interest in the case, Palpatine would be convicted. He'd be stripped of his ability to use the Force, and he'd live out the rest of his life in prison. He'd be stuck inside of a soundless room surrounded by white walls and a blinding white light. the darkest of people in the galaxy destroyed by what he hated most, the light. The Republic Senate would reunify with the rest of the galaxy, but a key piece to the reunification was the disbanding of the Chancellor-related powers. The Skywalker family would have their happily ever after, and the Jedi would get back to right where they were before the war, helping out the people of the galaxy.